Part 1. The Wrong Drop Zone. The night drop over Holland began wrong and got worse. Jake McNiece felt the C-47's engines shift pitch, heard the green light too early, and jumped into darkness that smelled of canal water and burning villages. His parachute opened hard, jerking him sideways, as tracers from somewhere northeast stitched red lines across the September sky. Below, the Dutch polders spread like a broken mirror. Flooded fields reflecting moonlight, narrow roads elevated above water, and the scattered silhouettes of windmills and farmhouses marking terrain that didn't match the briefing maps. He hit mud, not grass. His equipment bundle separated somewhere in the descent, lost to the swamps. McNiece rolled, fought his harness free, and crouched in the shadow of a drainage ditch, listening. Distant small arms fire. Aircraft engines fading. Dutch voices calling from a farmhouse. No sign of his filthy 13. Operation Market Garden, the plan to seize bridges from Eindhoven to Arnhem, open a corridor north into Germany, end the war by Christmas. McNiece's role: demolition sabotage behind German lines, blow communications, fuel dumps, anything that delayed their response. Simple on paper. Reality delivered him alone in enemy territory with a grease gun, 4 TNT blocks in his musette bag, and no idea where the rest of his stick had landed. He moved south, using the raised road as a guide. Other paratroopers materialized from the darkness, men from Dog Company, Headquarters Company, even 2 from the 82nd who'd been blown off course. By dawn, McNiece had gathered 11 Americans at a crossroads near a village the locals called Sun, 8 kilometers south of Eindhoven. They'd secured a stone barn, checked weapons, and discovered their collective situation, scattered, undersupplied, and directly in the path of German forces retreating from Eindhoven toward defensible positions at Best and Sint-Udenrode. The Sun Bridge was the problem. Intelligence said it was lightly defended, but radio chatter suggested German engineers were rigging it for demolition. American units were supposed to secure it, but the drop zone chaos had delayed everything. McNiece's group sat at a crossroads that controlled the southern approach, and through his borrowed binoculars, he'd already spotted German reconnaissance vehicles probing the roads before dawn. Then the British glider crashed. It came in too fast, overshot its landing zone, and ploughed through a hedge into the field directly behind McNiece's position. The impact killed the pilot and 2 of the 4 passengers, but the cargo spilled intact: medical supplies, ammunition crates, and, improbably, a boy's anti-tank rifle with 60 rounds of .55 caliber armor-piercing ammunition. McNiece stared at the weapon. He'd seen them in training films: British infantry anti-tank rifles, brutally powerful, shoulder-fired, capable of punching through light armor at close range, but obsolete against modern tanks. The 101st didn't carry them. Most American units laughed at the recoil that could dislocate shoulders and crack collarbones. A private from Fox Company, face still blackened with jump grease, knelt beside the rifle. "Think it works?" "Only one way to find that out," McNiece said. He was calculating, not odds, but consequences. His TNT blocks were meant for sabotage, not anti-tank defense. The nearest bazooka team was gone, scattered or captured. German armor was moving. The Sun Bridge sat exposed. And this British rifle, heavy and unfamiliar, represented the only anti-armor weapon within 800 meters. The calculated risk was already forming in McNiece's mind, though he didn't have words for it yet. Just the shape of a plan that felt reckless and necessary in equal measure. The kind of improvisation that had earned him a reputation back in the States as McNasty. The demolition man officers barely trusted, but couldn't afford to lose. The Dutch farmer whose barn they'd occupied brought weak coffee and hard bread. Through broken English and hand gestures he warned, "Dwitzers kommen, Germans coming, Panzers, morning." McNiece nodded, studied the crossroads, and began to see it differently. Not as a position to defend, but as a kill zone to exploit. If he could stop one vehicle here, block the road, buy time. "You planning something stupid?" the Fox Company sergeant asked, watching McNiece measure distances with his eyes. Depends, McNiece said. How stupid is using a gun I've never fired to stop a tank I can't destroy? That's pretty stupid. Then yeah, McNiece said. I'm planning something stupid. The pre-dawn darkness held. Somewhere northeast, toward Eindhoven, heavier gunfire erupted. The British XXX Corps was supposed to be rolling north by now, but the sound suggested they were still fighting for the city. Market Garden's timetable was already slipping. Every hour the Germans controlled these roads was an hour closer to failure. McNiece cleaned the boy's rifle, loaded it, and positioned it behind sandbags at the narrowest part of the crossroads, where the road squeezed between the canal and the barn's stone wall. He placed his 4 TNT blocks in shallow scrapes beneath mud and straw, 20 meters forward, right where a vehicle would have to stop if the lead element broke down or got hit. The private from Nebraska, kid couldn't have been older than 20, stared at the rifle's massive bolt and brutal lines. You ever fire one of these? He asked McNiece. No, McNiece said. You? I'm from Nebraska. We had cows. That'll have to do. The morning fog rolled in from the polders, thick and grey. Through it, McNiece heard the deep, unmistakable growl of German armor moving south. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. Part 2. The Sound of Steel. The Stug assault guns appeared as shadows first, darker shapes moving through the pre-dawn fog along the road from Best. McNiece counted 2 vehicles, maybe more behind them, advancing cautiously with infantry scouts spread along the verges. The lead vehicle's commander stood half-exposed in his hatch, scanning hedgerows through binoculars, confident in his armor and the supposed disarray of American paratroopers scattered across the Dutch countryside. McNiece's 11 men lay dispersed in positions he'd marked during the night, behind stone walls, in drainage ditches, covering withdrawal routes through the village. The boy's rifle rested on sandbags, aimed down the road's narrowest section, where the canal and barn created a choke point barely 20 meters wide. The private from Nebraska crouched behind it, fingers white on the grip, breathing shallow and fast. "Don't fire until I say," McNiece whispered. "One shot, aim low, drive sprocket or track assembly. What if I miss? Then we run like hell and hope the bridge engineers have better luck than we do." The Stugs rolled closer. McNiece could smell diesel exhaust, mixing with fog and canal water. Dutch civilians watched from shuttered windows, families trapped in their own homes while armies maneuvered through streets where children had played the day before. An old woman made the sign of the cross as the German infantry scouts passed her garden gate. The tactical math was brutal and simple. The boy's rifle might penetrate the Stug's thinner side or rear armor at close range. Frontal armor was hopeless. McNiece's TNT satchels, buried in the mud ahead, were rigged with salvaged blasting caps and DT cord run back to his position. The plan depended on sequence and timing. Wound the lead vehicle in the kill zone, force it to stop, detonate the charges beneath or beside it, create a roadblock that would hold long enough for engineers at the Sun Bridge to complete their work. 15 variables could derail it. The boy's rifle could misfire. The armor-piercing round could ricochet. The Stug could reverse out of the kill zone. The satchel charges could fail in wet ground. German infantry could flank through the fields before McNiece's men could withdraw. The fog could lift, exposing positions. Radio communication with other American units was sporadic at best. Broken messages about scattered companies, missing officers, bridges secured or lost. British armor still fighting into Eindhoven against heavier resistance than anyone had predicted. The lead Stug reached the barn, its commander still standing in the hatch, looking northeast toward the Sun Bridge. McNiece held his breath. Watched the vehicle enter the narrows, saw its tracks churn mud where his charges lay hidden beneath straw and debris. "Now," he said quietly. The boy's rifle fired with a crack that seemed to tear the fog apart, sharp, violent, louder than any weapon McNiece had trained with. The recoil hammered the kid from Nebraska backward, but the shot went true. The armor-piercing round struck low. Right track assembly, not a kill but a solid hit. The Stu-G lurched, slewed sideways, its driver fighting controls as the damaged track began to separate. The commander ducked into his hatch, shouting orders McNiece couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. The second Stug stopped 20 meters behind, its commander trying to assess the threat. Infantry ambush or anti-tank position. McNiece yanked the DT cord igniter. The 4 TNT satchels exploded with a flat, concussive whoomp. Not Hollywood fireworks, but functional demolition work, the kind that lifts and breaks rather than incinerates. The blast caught the wounded Stu-G's front end, heaved it sideways, and dropped 2 tons of German steel into the drainage ditch. Mud, smoke, and burning oil obscured the crossroads. The stone barn's wall took shrapnel pocks, but held. The second Stu-G's machine gun opened up, raking hedgerows and walls in wide, suppressive bursts. McNiece's men were already moving, falling back through pre-scouted alleys, gardens, and barnyards, covering each other in the practiced choreography of paratroopers who'd learned that survival meant never staying in the same spot twice. McNiece dragged the Nebraska kid with him, leaving the boy's rifle behind. They ran through the village, past staring civilians, through a cemetery where headstones marked centuries of Dutch dead, and into a tobacco barn on the southern edge where the Fox Company sergeant had established a rally point. "Did it work?" the sergeant gasped. McNiece looked back. Through the lifting fog, the wrecked Stu-G sat at an angle across the road, its bulk blocking passage for anything heavier than a motorcycle. German infantry was advancing cautiously, but the armor had stopped. "For now," McNiece said. Radio crackle brought fragmentary news. American engineers had reached the Sun Bridge. German forces were preparing to blow it, a race between demolitions, theirs and ours, both sides trying to deny the same span of steel and concrete to the enemy. The roadblock McNiece had created bought 90 minutes, time measured in lives, objectives, and the grinding calculus of a battle where every hour mattered. A British lieutenant from the vanguard of XXX Corps arrived mid-morning, his scout car threading through back roads. He stared at the wrecked Stu-G, the improvised mine crater, the abandoned boy's rifle still steaming in the mud. "Who did this?" he asked. "Some paratroopers," the sergeant said, "got scattered in the drop." The lieutenant studied McNiece. Filthy uniform, no helmet, muddy hands that smelled of TNT and det cord. "You hit that with a boy's rifle and satchel charges?" "Wasn't much else available," McNiece said. The lieutenant shook his head, half impressed, half appalled. He didn't ask names, didn't write it down. The moment was already dissolving into the larger chaos of Market Garden's problematic first day. Bridges missed, drop zones wrong, timetables slipping, British armour still fighting for Eindhoven, while German counterattacks probed for weaknesses in the newly established corridor. McNiece found a stone step behind the tobacco barn and sat, hands trembling slightly, ears still ringing. The Nebraska kid sat beside him, face pale. "You okay?" McNiece asked. "That recoil damn near broke me." "Yeah." McNiece pulled a crushed cigarette from his pocket, lit it with shaking hands. "You did good." They sat in silence while the battle's architecture shifted around them, radios crackling with new orders, vehicles moving, distant explosions marking other small disasters and narrow victories playing out across the Dutch countryside. Part 3. The Weight of Wire. The Sun Bridge exploded at 13:40 hours, September 18th. McNiece heard it from 4 kilometers away, a deep, rolling detonation that echoed across the polders and sent a column of smoke rising above the tree line. American engineers had blown it themselves, denying it to German forces who'd been minutes from seizing it intact. The roadblock McNiece had improvised that morning had helped buy those minutes, though no official report would connect the two events. By afternoon, McNiece's scratch unit had been absorbed into a composite company holding the village perimeter. Officers appeared, sorted men back into proper chains of command, and established defensive positions, while British XXX Corps armour finally pushed through Eindhoven and began bridging operations at Son. The operation's timetable, already optimistic, was slipping badly. Arnhem, the final bridge, felt farther away with each passing hour. McNiece found himself in a cellar command post, cleaning his grease gun, while a captain from battalion staff tried to account for missing equipment and scattered personnel. The demolition charges McNiece had used that morning were supposed to be inventoried, allocated, tracked. Instead, they'd been buried in Dutch mud and detonated to stop a vehicle no one had predicted would be there. "You're Sergeant McNiece?" the captain asked, studying a roster. "Yeah, Demolitions Specialist 506th. That's right. You're listed as assigned to the Filthy 13. Where's the rest of your unit?" "Scattered in the drop. I've been moving with whoever needs it." The captain made notes, frowning. "The TNT you used this morning wasn't authorized." McNiece met his eyes. "The stooges coming down that road weren't authorized either." The captain's jaw tightened, but he didn't push it. The calculus of battle made accountability complicated. McNiece had stopped enemy armor from reaching a critical bridge, but he'd done it by improvising with gear meant for different targets, using a weapon from another army, and making tactical decisions usually reserved for officers. In peacetime, it might be court-martial material. In combat, especially in the chaotic opening hours of Market Garden, it was just another data point in a situation rapidly exceeding everyone's plans. Later, McNiece walked the village with the Nebraska kid, checking positions, scrounging ammunition, talking to Dutch civilians who shared what they knew about German movements. An old farmer pointed northeast, describing panzers he'd seen moving toward Best. A schoolteacher, speaking careful English, asked if the Americans would stay or leave them to German reprisals. "We'll stay," McNiece said, though he had no authority to promise it. The weight of that promise settled on him as they returned to their defensive sector. The knowledge that improvised decisions made in the fog and adrenaline of combat created consequences that rippled outward, touching lives beyond the immediate tactical picture. The family in the farmhouse near the crossroads, the civilians in Sun who'd watched the bridge blow, the scattered paratroopers depending on officers and NCOs to somehow stitch together coherence from the chaos of a plan already coming apart. That evening, McNiece sat with the Fox Company sergeant in a barn loft, watching the road north, where British tanks and trucks moved toward the temporary bridge at Sun. Supply columns, ambulances, artillery. The machinery of Market Garden grinding forward, despite the delays, despite the scattered drops, despite everything going differently than the neat arrows on maps. "You think we'll make it to Arnhem?" the sergeant asked. McNiece thought about the distance, the bridges still ahead, the timetable already blown, the scattered intelligence about German strength. "Don't know," he said, "but someone's got to try." They shared a cigarette. Below, Dutch children played in the street, chasing each other around British vehicles, normalcy and war occupying the same narrow space. An old woman swept her doorstep, as if tidying could restore order to a world gone mad with armies and explosions. McNiece's hands no longer trembled, but something else had settled in. A different kind of tension, less acute than combat adrenaline, but more persistent. The recognition that this morning's action, successful as it seemed, was just one small maneuver in a vast, complicated operation where success and failure intertwined in ways that wouldn't be clear for days, maybe weeks. The boy's rifle was still out there, abandoned in the mud at the crossroads, the spent casing from that single shot McNiece had kept, stuffing it in his musette bag without thinking about why. A talisman, evidence, proof that the moment had happened, that the calculation had been real, that terror and decision had coexisted in the same heartbeat. As darkness fell over the Dutch countryside, German artillery began ranging on the new British bridge at Sun. The The shells walked closer, corrections called by unseen observers, each explosion marking the ongoing contest for roads, bridges, and the narrow corridor Market Garden needed to survive. McNiece checked his gear, redistributed the TNT blocks he'd scrounged from an engineer supply dump, and tried to sleep in a hayloft that smelled of tobacco and old wood. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by artillery, by the sound of diesel engines that could be friend or enemy, by the memory of that Stooge's track breaking under the boy's rifle's impact, and the moment after the charges blew, when he couldn't tell if the roadblock would hold or if German armor would simply push through and make the whole improvised gamble pointless. Outside, the war continued. Radios crackling, officers arguing, supply trucks moving, wounded being evacuated. And somewhere to the north, other paratroopers fighting their own isolated battles for bridges and roads that connected into a web of consequences McNiece couldn't fully see. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Part 4. The Narrowest Margin. September 19th brought rain and renewed German pressure. McNiece's composite unit received orders to patrol aggressively south of Sun, preventing enemy reconnaissance from getting clear views of the bridge construction and British supply columns. The mission felt exposed. Small teams moving through Dutch farmland where German positions could be anywhere, where every hedge and barn might conceal an ambush, where the flat terrain offered little cover and the waterlogged fields limited movement to narrow roads and elevated paths. McNiece led a patrol of 7 men, including the Nebraska kid who'd fired the boy's rifle. They moved through fog and drizzle, weapons ready, navigating by compass and landmarks that didn't always match their hastily drawn maps. The Dutch landscape felt alien, too flat, too open, too controlled by whoever held the roads. Contact came near a canal crossing east of Sun. German infantry, maybe a platoon, spread along the far bank, dug in and watching the approaches. McNiece's patrol went to ground in a drainage ditch, assessing. The Germans hadn't seen them yet. Radio communication with the company was scratchy, unreliable. The tactical question was simple: withdraw and report, or engage and try to disrupt what looked like a reconnaissance position. McNiece studied the ground. The canal was maybe 10 meters wide, too deep to wade, spanned by a small wooden bridge the Germans had partially demolished. Beyond it, a farmhouse and barn complex offered cover. If German forces controlled this crossing, they could observe British movements and direct artillery or counterattacks. "We should pull back," the Fox Company sergeant whispered. "Report it. Let them bring mortars or armor." McNiece nodded, but something caught his attention. Movement near the farmhouse. German engineers, carrying gear that looked like demolition equipment. They were preparing something, maybe mining the road, maybe rigging the farmhouse as a strong point. The calculation formed again, that same instinctive weighing of risk and consequence that had shaped the Crossroads fight. If he withdrew, reported, and waited for support, those German engineers might complete their work. If he engaged now, with 7 men against 20 or more, the odds were terrible, but the element of surprise might tip things just enough. "Hold position," McNiece said. "I'm going to get closer." "That's insane," the sergeant hissed. "Yeah," McNiece agreed. He handed off his grease gun, kept his knife and 2 grenades, and began crawling along the ditch toward the canal's edge. The distance felt infinite. 60 meters of exposed mud, cattails and reeds, moving inch by inch while German voices carried across the water and rain pattered on his helmet. McNiece reached a point where he could see the farmhouse clearly. The German engineers were rigging explosives in the structure's basement, probably planning to collapse it onto the road as a roadblock if American forces pushed this direction. McNiece considered his options. He had 2 grenades. 7 men in the ditch behind him, no heavy weapons, no artillery support. The margin between disrupting the German position and getting his patrol killed was invisibly thin. Then he saw the wire. The Germans had run demolition wire from the farmhouse across the canal, burying it shallowly in the mud of the near bank before it disappeared into brush. Standard procedure: detonate remotely from a safe position. But the wire's path was visible in places where rain had washed away soil, and McNiece suddenly understood if he could cut that wire, the German charges wouldn't fire. If the charges didn't fire, the farmhouse couldn't be collapsed as a roadblock. And if the Germans discovered their demolition had been sabotaged, they might assume a larger American force was operating in the area and withdraw rather than risk encirclement. It was a gamble wrapped in assumptions, wrapped in hope. McNiece crawled to the wire's near terminal, used his knife to carefully expose and cut it, then crawled back to the ditch. "What the hell did you just do?" the sergeant demanded. "Cut their det cord. When they try to blow that farmhouse, nothing's gonna happen." "And then what?" "Then they either check the wire and we shoot them, or they assume we're everywhere and pull back. That's not a plan. That's a prayer." "Yeah," McNiece said. "It is." They waited. Rain intensified. German voices continued across the canal, routine and confident. An hour passed. Then someone, maybe an officer, maybe an NCO, gave an order. McNiece saw movement near the farmhouse. A German soldier crouched, holding what looked like a plunger detonator, preparing to fire the charges. Nothing happened. Confusion on the German side, shouted questions. Someone pointed at the canal, gesturing toward the near bank where the wire disappeared. A soldier started across the partially demolished bridge, moving carefully, checking the wire's path. McNiece shot him, single round from his grease gun, the sound flat and brutal in the rain. The German fell. His comrades scrambled for cover, firing blind toward the American position. McNiece's patrol returned fire. 7 weapons against 20, the firefight brief and chaotic, but the effect was psychological. The Germans, suddenly uncertain about how many Americans were out there, how their demolition had been compromised, whether they were being encircled, began withdrawing. Not routed, just tactically pulling back to more defensible positions, conceding the canal crossing rather than risk a fight they didn't understand. McNiece's patrol held for 20 minutes, then withdrew themselves. Mission accomplished, but at a cost. McNiece felt more than measured. 1 German dead. 1 demolished farmhouse that wouldn't become a roadblock, 1 canal crossing temporarily denied to enemy reconnaissance, and 7 American paratroopers shaking with adrenaline and relief, wondering if what they'd just done was brilliance or insanity. Back at the company position, McNiece reported to the captain. Described the German engineers, the wire, the firefight. The captain listened, face unreadable. "You engaged a superior force with no support. I disrupted their demolition before they could complete it. You risked your entire patrol on cutting a wire?" "It worked." The captain stared at him. "This time it worked. Next time, you might get everyone killed." McNiece said nothing. What could he say? That every decision in combat balanced on the narrowest margin between working and catastrophic failure. That improvisation was survival when plans dissolved in the fog of scattered drops and enemy actions no intelligence officer had predicted. That the weight of those decisions, right or wrong, successful or disastrous, stayed with you in ways no after-action report could capture. The Nebraska kid found him later, sitting alone behind a barn, cleaning mud from his knife. "That was close," the kid said. "Yeah, you think it was worth it? 1 German dead, 1 farmhouse saved?" McNiece looked at him. "Ask me in 30 years. Maybe by then I'll know." Part 5. What the report doesn't say. The secret behind Jake McNiece's actions at Sun wasn't courage. It was terror managed through calculation, instinct wrestling with responsibility, and the growing weight of being the man others expected to figure it out when everything went wrong. The reports would later note effective resistance and enemy armor delayed, clean phrases that compressed chaos into bureaucratic language. They wouldn't mention the 15 seconds McNiece spent frozen behind those sandbags, hand on the det cord, watching the Stew enter the kill zone, while his mind screamed that this was suicide, that the boy's rifle might misfire, that the satchel charges might fail, that 11 men trusted him with a plan built on hope and borrowed equipment. September 20th brought news from across the Market Garden corridor. The bridge at Nijmegen remained contested. Arnhem was a disaster. British paratroopers surrounded, cut off, fighting against SS panzer divisions that weren't supposed to be there. The entire operation teetered on the edge of failure, held together by narrow threads of supply lines, improvised bridges, and scattered units holding terrain they'd barely secured. McNiece sat in a cellar with the Fox Company sergeant and the Nebraska kid, listening to radio traffic that painted a picture of an offensive consuming itself. The sergeant voiced what everyone was thinking. "We're not making it to Arnhem, are we?" "No," McNiece said quietly. "We're not." The weight of that realization settled over them. Not just tactical failure, but human cost. British paratroopers dying at Arnhem because the ground operation couldn't reach them in time. Because drop zones were wrong. Because resistance was stronger than predicted. Because bridges blew or didn't blow at the worst possible moments. And underneath it all, McNiece carried his own private accounting. What if the Stew fight had gone differently? What if he'd waited for proper anti-tank support that never came? What if his improvised roadblock had failed, and German armor had reached the Sun Bridge before engineers could blow it? Would Market Garden have collapsed entirely? Or would it have made no difference at all, just another small eddy in a battle already too big for any single action to determine? The Nebraska kid broke. The silence. "You saved lives that morning, at the crossroads." "Maybe," McNiece said. "Or maybe I just delayed something inevitable." "That's not what the lieutenant said. He called it effective resistance." McNiece laughed, bitter and quiet. "Effective resistance. That's what it looks like on paper. You know what it felt like? Like guessing wrong would get everyone killed, and guessing right meant we got to live long enough to guess again tomorrow." The sergeant leaned back against cold stone. "That canal crossing yesterday, cutting that wire. That was the same thing, wasn't it? Another guess." "Yeah, but it worked. This time. The real secret, the one McNiece couldn't articulate even to himself, was simpler and heavier than any tactical explanation. He was terrified, not just of dying, but of being responsible for others dying because he'd calculated wrong, because his improvisation had been reckless rather than brilliant, because the line between the two was so thin it didn't exist, just luck, timing, and consequences he couldn't control or predict. The boy's rifle casing he'd kept felt heavier in his pocket. A reminder, not of victory, but of fragility. How easily that morning could have gone wrong, how the spent casing represented not his skill, but the margin of fortune that separated survival from disaster. A chaplain visited the cellar that evening, moving among the men, offering quiet words. When he reached McNiece, he paused. "You holding up, Sergeant?" "Yeah, fine." The chaplain didn't push, but his eyes suggested he saw through the lie. War's got a weight that lands different on everyone, especially on those who make the decisions others depend on. McNiece said nothing. "If you need to talk." "I don't." After the chaplain moved on, the Nebraska kid spoke softly. "You know what my folks would say. They'd say you're a hero." "I'm not." "Then what are you?" McNiece thought about it. About the Stew burning in the ditch. About the German soldier he'd shot at the canal. About the bridges blown and held and lost across Holland. About the fine line between actions that save lives and actions that spend them, and how impossible it is to know which category you're in until it's too late to change course. "I'm just trying not to get anyone killed because I guessed wrong," he finally said. The kid absorbed that. "Is that what this is? Guessing? Best I can tell, yeah. Orders, training, experience, it all matters. But when you're in it, when it's happening, you're making decisions based on incomplete information and hoping they work out. Sometimes they do. Sometimes." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Outside, rain continued. Market Garden ground forward, slower than planned, bleeding men and machines and hope into Dutch mud. The corridor held, barely. Arnhem fell. And in a cellar in Sun, a demolition sergeant from Oklahoma sat with a spent rifle casing in his pocket, wondering how many more guesses he'd have to make before this war released him, or claimed him the way it had claimed so many others. Part 6. The sound that stays Market Garden ended not with victory, but with withdrawal. The bridge at Arnhem couldn't be held. British paratroopers evacuated across the Rhine under fire, leaving thousands dead or captured. The corridor from Eindhoven to Nijmegen held, but it wasn't enough. The war wouldn't end by Christmas, maybe not for years. McNiece rejoined what remained of the Filthy 13 in late September. They'd been scattered across the operation, each man carrying his own stories of improvisation, near misses, and small victories that meant everything in the moment and almost nothing in the strategic failure. They greeted him with dark humor and knowing looks, asking about the rumor that he'd stopped a stoogie with a British rifle he'd never trained on. "It's true," the Nebraska kid confirmed, before McNiece could deflect. "Of course it is," one of the 13 said. "McNasty does everything ass backwards and somehow makes it work," but there was respect underneath the jokes. They understood that survival in this war required constant improvisation, that rules and doctrine dissolved in the chaos of scattered drops and shifting objectives, and that McNiece's willingness to make the hard guesses, right or wrong, was the kind of leadership that kept men alive when everything went to hell. The after-action reports for Market Garden filled volumes, unit movements, casualties, equipment losses, tactical lessons. Buried in the paperwork, one line noted, "Effective defensive action at Sun Crossroads, 18 Sept 1944. Enemy armor delayed pending bridge demolition." No names, no details about boys' rifles or improvised satchel charges or the calculations that went into blocking a road with tools that weren't supposed to work that way. McNiece kept the spent casing, carried it through the rest of the war, through Bastogne, through the push into Germany, through the chaos and exhaustion and endless improvisations that defined airborne operations. The casing became a private symbol of something he couldn't fully explain. How terror and decision coexisted in the same breath, how responsibility for others' lives weighed more than any equipment or order, how the margin between success and catastrophe was so thin it felt like guessing in the dark. Years later, long after the war ended, McNiece would sometimes hear the sound of heavy trucks crossing bridges, the rumble of steel on steel, the deep engine tones, and for just a moment he'd be back in Holland, back at that crossroads, watching the stoogie enter the kill zone, hand on the DT cord, the weight of 11 lives depending on whether his calculation held or collapsed into disaster. He never talked about it much. When pressed, he'd joke about borrowing a British rifle, about improvising with whatever was available, about the chaos of Market Garden, making everyone improvise in ways no training had covered. But he wouldn't talk about the terror, wouldn't admit how close it had been, wouldn't explain that the heroism others saw was, from the inside, just fear managed through action, instinct overriding the very reasonable impulse to run. The Nebraska kid survived the war too. They crossed paths at a reunion in the 1960s. By then, both men had families, jobs, lives built on foundations of memory and silence about what the war had really felt like. They shared a drink, talked about weather and crops, and anything except the cellar in Sun, where they'd sat wondering if tomorrow would bring another impossible decision. Finally, the kid, now middle-aged graying, asked, "You ever regret it? The crossroads? The wire at the canal?" McNiece thought carefully. "No, but I think about it. The ways it could have gone wrong, the German I shot, the Stug crew, whether any of it mattered in the larger picture. It mattered to us, the ones who were there. Yeah." McNiece turned his glass on the bar. "But that's not the same as knowing if it was right. Just knowing it worked out. Close enough? Has to be." They finished their drinks, shook hands, returned to their separate lives, carrying memories no one else could fully share or understand. The sound of that boy's rifle firing, the feeling of discord in shaking hands, the weight of decisions made in fog and terror, with consequences that rippled across lives and battlefields in ways impossible to measure. The war became history. McNiece became a story, a legend attached to the Filthy 13 and their unconventional courage. Historians would write about market gardens' failures and successes, about bridges and corridors, and the narrow margins that separated victory from defeat. Some might mention the roadblock at Sun in footnotes, praising tactical improvisation under pressure. But none of them would capture what McNiece carried inside, the knowledge that courage looked different from the outside than it felt from within, that every successful improvisation was shadowed by the terror of what would have happened if luck had shifted slightly. That responsibility for others' lives weighed more than any medal or citation. The boy's rifle casing stayed with him until he died, a private talisman. Evidence that one morning in Holland, a demolition sergeant from Oklahoma had guessed right when everything else was going wrong, and that the sound of that single shot, the explosion that followed, and the weight of that decision had stayed with him across decades, a reminder that war's real cost isn't measured in reports, but in the memories carried by those who survived. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.